Hey everyone, from the Bureau of Local Government Finance, Department of Finance, I am Brenda L. Miranda of the Local Fiscal Policy Service. For today's topic, we will be handling local revenue generation and LGU credit financing. On the next slide, you will see the specific objectives of this session. First, for the participants to be able to understand the available financial resources and latest practices in funding disaster rehabilitation and recovery. And second, to enhance the participants' the ability to prepare and facilitate planning for disaster mitigation and post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery. The BLGF, as an authority in local finance, hereby provides the short presentation regarding LGU funding sources for disaster management and other potential sources of funds that may be utilized for disaster rebuilding and recovery. Let's start off with the lecture proper. The Local Government Code of 1991 has provided LGUs the responsibility of delivering local and basic public services and raising local or own source of revenues for financing their expenditure assignment. Under the LGC, LGUs have autonomy in deciding on the composition of local spending, taxing, and borrowing that they would need to meet local development objectives. The LGC also transferred to LGUs certain regulatory functions and also encouraged LGUs to explore alternative sources of revenue by exercising their corporate powers in partnership with the private sector. In effect, the LGC promoted local autonomy by devolving expenditure responsibilities and vested greater taxing powers to LGUs. The 1987 Constitution, the Local Government Code of 1991, and LGU's local ordinances form the three-tiered legal framework of local resource mobilization. The taxing powers of the LGUs emanates from the Article 10, Section 5 of the 1987 Constitution, which provides that each local government unit shall have the power to create its own sources of revenues and to levy taxes, fees, and charges subject to such guidelines and limitations as the Congress may provide, consistent with the basic policy of local autonomy. Such taxes, fees, and charges shall accrue exclusively to the local governments. The same provision of the Constitution was almost copied verbatim in Section 129 of the 1991 LGC, which states that each local government unit shall exercise its power to create its own sources of revenue and to levy taxes, fees, and charges subject to the provisions herein, consistent with the basic policy of local autonomy. Such taxes, fees, and charges shall accrue exclusively to the local government units. As you will note, such power to create own source revenue of LEU has already been laid down and spelled out in the LGC. The LGC enumerated all the impositions that a province, city, municipality, and barangay can impose and collect. However, such power is not self-executor. The LGU still needs to decide what taxes, fees, and charges to impose and what rate. And the decision on what taxes, fees, and charges to impose is vested with the concerned local sanggunian as provided in Section 132 of the Local Government Code, which states that the power to impose a tax, fee, or charge or to generate revenue under this code shall be exercised by the sanggunian of the local government unit concerned through an appropriate ordinance. What are the LGU sources of revenues? Basically, we can classify the sources of revenues of LGUs into two, the internal and external sources of revenues. As you can see, except for borrowings, The external sources of revenues of LGUs come from the national government and from some institutions from which the LGUs have no control, while the internal sources of revenues of LGUs are basically the result of the provisions of sections 129 and 132 of the LGC, from which the LGUs have complete control. That is why we are encouraging LGUs to exercise the provisions of sections 129 and 132, but such exercise should be consistent with guidelines and limitations provided in the Local Government Code. Local government revenue comes mainly from the impositions of local taxes, fees, and charges, and fund transfer from external sources. Due to the devolution of power from the national to local government, LGUs are allowed by law to create their own sources of revenue and to levy taxes, fees, and charges consistent with the basic policy of local autonomy. External sources come from the internal revenue allotment, now the national tax allotment, and other shares from special laws, grants and aids, public-private partnerships, and borrowings, while local sources include tax revenues from the real property tax and local business tax, and non-tax revenues from bills and charges, receipts, or income from local economic enterprises. Let me give you a picture of the financial performance of the LGUs. In fiscal year 2020, local revenues reached 251.65 billion, which is 1% lower than the previous year. External sources increased by 18%, which includes the internal revenue allotment of the LGUs. It should be noted that other central transfers significantly increased by 132% from 27.57 billion in 2019 to 63.90 billion in 2020. Collectively, LGUs realized a year-on-year growth rate of 12% in their total operating income. Local sources comprise 30% of the total current operating income of the LGUs, while external sources remain to be the main revenue source of LGUs at 70%. Let me give you some more numbers on the next slide. As expected, cities collected the most from local sources with 171.90 billion revenues, followed by the municipalities and provinces having 44.72 billion and 27.57 billion collections, respectively. Internal revenue allotment under external source, on the other hand, remain to be the main source of LGU's revenue, contributing 62% of the total revenues for the year. If you look up the era dependency, you will see that provinces and municipalities almost mirrored the era dependency of the consolidated fiscal position for about 78% and 72% dependency. This is not the case in the cities. Cities have 42% dependency and era. How about the roles of LGU officials in local revenue generation? The local chief executive and the local treasurer are mandated by the code to be the prime movers of local revenue generation. The local chief executive provides the executive direction and control in maximizing revenue collection as well as regulating the business activities within the LGU. On the other hand, the local treasurer is responsible for collecting local revenues for LGUs. However, there are many other key players in resource mobilization. The local sanggunian, being presided by the vice mayor or the vice governor, as the case may be, contributes the necessary legislation through ordinances and resolutions on appropriations and revenue generating measures. The local finance committee, composed of the local planning and development officer, the local budget officer, and the local treasurer, whose primary function is to provide reasonable projects vis-a-vis collectibles of the LGUs for the ensuing fiscal year. They are the recommendatory authority to the LCE regarding the appropriate imposition of taxes and other revenue measures and or borrowings to support the LGU budget. Likewise, the local assessor plays a very important role in revenue collection because the RPT collection of the local treasurer is based on the assessment made by the local assessor. The local accountant maintains and updates records of transactions on the expenditure side. Even barangays play a significant role in revenue generation as they are deputized to collect fees and enact ordinances on revenue generation subject to the limitation of applicable laws, rules, and regulations. As experience has shown, when all who share responsibilities in local revenue administration work as a team towards revenue mobilization, optimum results are attainable. Resource mobilization must be seen as a total effort of all local officials and employees. With the taxing powers of LGUs, let's look at the next slide. What are the fiscal gap? Is there a fiscal gap? And how do we close the fiscal gap? Because of the increase in demand of public services, generally driven by growth in population caused by natural growth and migration, the natural tendency is that level of expenditure has to also increase proportionately to the growth in population. However, because of the occurrence of calamity and developmental needs of the LGUs, the financial resources of the LGUs coming from the national transfers and internal sources may not be enough despite the implementation of revenue collection strategies. And one of the funding sources for LGU is credit financing. And the next slide is local debt policy. As one of the four pillars of fiscal decentralization, subnational debt policy and management still has guidelines that need to be met. First, it should build the capacity of local governments to borrow money to cover their expenditure responsibilities alongside their devolved functions. Debt management also must prioritize financing capital infrastructure expenditure and tax flows, and political accountability must be fostered out of these decisions. It is also vital that the national government play its role, the prevention of systemic LGU debt crisis that could force the national government to bail out heavily indebted LGUs. Next is strengthening the implementation of the statutory limit on LGU debts and the promotion of responsible and credible debt management among the local government units. The next slide is the legal framework of borrowing. The Local Government Code and its implementing rules and regulations, or IRR, made it possible for LGUs to create indebtedness and avail of credit facilities for local infrastructure and socio-economic development projects with government or private banks and lending institutions. The code also states that debt servicing must not exceed 20% of the LGU's annual regular income to ensure that this limit will not be breached and the LGUs would maximize the potential of their credit line. The Department of Finance is mandated to render technical assistance to any LGU in the availment of credit facilities. The Bureau, as an attached agency of the Department of Finance, created by the virtue of EO 127, is also mandated to develop and promote plans and programs for the improvement of resource management systems, collection enforcement mechanisms, and credit utilization schemes at the local levels. The next slide enumerates the different forms of indebtedness. Under existing laws, the following are forms of indebtedness allowed for LGUs. First, loans, credits, and other forms of indebtedness. Next are deferred payment and other financial schemes, bonds and other long-term securities, interlocal government loans, grants, and other subsidies, loans from funds secured by national government from foreign sources. Among the forms of local indebtedness, availing of credit lines through loans is the most frequently utilized by LGUs. The LGC limits the purpose of local indebtedness. These purposes or projects all point to a unifying goal to assure LGUs economic growth and make them less IRA dependent. How about the process? How do they avail of borrowings from lending institutions? In summary, this is the LGU loan application process and procedures. It involves four key institutions: the LGU, the lending institution, the BLGF, and the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Those in shaded diagrams pertaining to the roles and functions of the BLGFs, which is mainly on the issuance of the Certificate of Net Debt Service Ceiling and Borrowing Capacity. Aside from the Sangguniang resolution to enter into indebtedness and inclusion in the LGU's annual investment plan and the Monetary Board opinion from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, this certificate being issued by the BLGF is among the ex-ante control and regulations set in place to monitor the borrowings of LGUs. At present, BLGF requires four main documentary requirements from borrowing LGUs. Back in 2012, the number of required documents was 12. This drop in the number of requirements made it easier for borrowing LGUs to comply. This also made the overall process of certification faster. The borrowing LGUs submit these requirements to the BLGF offices in their region. The regional offices then transmit these documents to us in the central office. After a series of evaluations and upon the completion of requirements, BLGF then issues a certificate. The certificate involves computation of three main figures: the debt service ceiling, the net debt service ceiling, and the borrowing capacity. First is the debt service ceiling. This is the maximum amount that an LGU can appropriate in the annual budget for the payment of its loan, statutory, and contractual obligations. This is equal to 20% of their annual regular income. The average previous 3 years locally sourced income plus other shares from national taxes based on data plus actual annual internal revenue allotment based on the data from the budget department. Second is the net debt service ceiling. It is equal to the DSC less all amortizations payable during the year. Third is the borrowing capacity. It is the maximum amount of statutory and contractual obligations that an LGU may incur over a period of 1 or more years at a specified rate of interest. The tenor and interest rate are involved in the computation of the annuity factor. This is achieved by applying the LGU's net debt service ceiling to the annuity factor. The certificate has three parts: the letter to the local chief executive, the certificate, and directives to the local treasurer. The release of certificates is controlled and monitored. Once a certificate is approved and released, an original copy is issued each for LGU, lending institution, and BSP. The certificate also provides the following: the terms of the loan as to the period, the interest rate, and the grace period and principal. The name of the lending institution is also specified. The purpose of the loan as authorized by the LGU, the certificate number, and the date it was issued by the BLGF. Certificates issued to LGUs declared under the state of calamity have a validity of 2 years. So before we end our presentation, let me give you some key takeaway message on LGU borrowings. First, it is beneficial for LGUs in good financial standing, have good repayment record if they are already a borrower, have the projects well planned in their investment plans, and the window being offered has a low interest rate and reasonable tenor. Next, borrowing is not ideal for LGUs with a budgetary deficit, have records of past due and default, have questionable projects or projects not identified in their investment plans, and the window being offered has a high interest rate and the tenor exceeds the economic useful life of the project proposed. And in summary, what we have presented are the sources of revenues of the local government units. We have the internal sources generated from the taxing powers of the LGUs. We have the external sources, the transfer from national government. And if these funding sources are not enough, the LGU can now resort to borrowing or credit financing subject to the debt policy management and rules. That's all from the Bureau of Local Government Finance, Department of Finance. Thank you.